good evening, good afternoon, and good morning at the same time towards all of you, depending from where on this planet you have joined us today, and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar on investigating infrastructure, ecology, sustainability, and society. I very much hope that you, as well as your near and dear ones, are well and in good spirits in these concerning times. My name is Marion Mueller, and I am working with the Heinrich Stiftungs or Heinrich Foundation's regional office in New Delhi here in India. And the Heinrich Stiftung is a green think tank that is headquartered in Germany and is part of the worldwide green movement. Our work in the South Asian region and actually all over Asia began in 1993, and our office in India that was set up in 2002 is actually this year in August celebrating its 20 years anniversary. The work of the foundation in the South Asian region has over all these years focused on creating and opening up spaces for critical dialogue between actors from civil society, from academia, from media, from think tanks, and from governments in predominantly three thematic fields or three thematic areas. One, the broad field of ecology, meaning protection of the environment and of natural resources, supporting initiatives against climate change and for a just energy transition, and supporting networking and dialogues about alternative worldviews and alternative development paradigms. Two, in the field of democracy, highlighting issues of pluralism, inclusion, and conflict transformation, looking into aspects of gender, into aspects of location, space, ethnicity, or culture. And thirdly, overall, we and our partners have continuously been supporting processes that aimed to ensure that civil society's voices and civil society's interests from all over the region and within the above mentioned thematic areas are being heard as part of democratic governance processes. And you are all invited to look up more about our work at our website, and the links to those websites will be posted to you shortly. One important part of our work that you will find on our regional office website is a web dossier with the same name as today's event, Investigating Infrastructure, Ecology, Sustainability, and Society. This dossier has started in 2018, and after we had been part of a discussion amongst our foundation's offices about impacts of infrastructure developments worldwide, and looking into the Asia region at this particular time, this was the time when the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative was really catching large scales in many Southeast and South Asian countries and beyond. And India, in the interest of economic development, was lining out infrastructure development initiatives and policies domestically towards the region and through overseas investments, also, for example, in Africa. So with much analysis on the economic, developmental, and political issues of these developments emerging in media and in academic spaces and in debates in general amongst civil society actors, we were wondering what this now so generated new infrastructure paradigm would actually mean for India, and in particular in social political terms, and how it would affect the environment and people in terms of their livelihoods. And the idea of the web dossier was to constitute an online forum, an online platform to investigate into these questions through contributions from various expert authors with diverse backgrounds, sharing multidisciplinary analysis. And until now, 4 years later, I think the dossier has grown into a rich repository of ideas, and the readers will find thoughts about how infrastructure can be analyzed and interpreted beyond hard facts and figures through, for example, the lenses of regional diversities, here predominantly the northeastern region of India, but also through aspects of gender or youth, the lens of tourism, in digital spaces, or through taking a look at natural and traditional infrastructures itself. The contributions that you will find there are a rich assemblage of academic analysis, reports or references to reports, stories, poetry, accompanied by infographics, photo galleries, but also other means of cultural production. And I would, at this point, really like to thank all the contributors of the dossier for sharing their knowledge and insights with all of us. I also take the opportunity to announce that we are currently in the process of creating a printed volume out of all of these online contributions, which we hope to launch by the end of the first quarter of 2022. And this webinar today in parallel is an attempt to reach out to a larger audience beyond the medium of publishings and to move one more step ahead into a critical dialogue. So we hope to follow up with some more webinar debates alike. Before we begin today's discussion, I also would like to send out a vote of thanks to my colleagues of the HPS office here in Delhi for all their creative efforts that enabled us to assemble this web dossier, to keep it meaningful for such a large audience over so many years, and to transfer it into a printed volume at the moment and into this webinar, which will happen today. Before I close, I just wanted to say that in the midst of this ecological crisis that has been unfolding around all of us worldwide and on an unprecedented scale, especially over these last 2 years, and that really makes visible, like under a magnifying glass, the linkages between us humans and between humans and nature on micro levels, but really also moving beyond regions and all around the planet. We hope that the debate that we will have today and in future webinars will contribute towards creating the space for a dialogue about why it is important to perceive infrastructure beyond the standard parameters that are so often wrapped with the terminologies of sustainable development. And why such a dialogue needs to be focusing on aspects of ecology, of participation, of people, and why such a debate should not only highlight alternative development paradigms, but actually at its center, open up to include alternative or indigenous worldviews. We have a very energetic and knowledgeable panel here with us to kick off this debate. Everyone on the panel has been contributing to the web dossier as well. And I am now very happy to hand over all further proceedings of today's discussion to Professor Jabin T. Jacob. Jabin T. Jacob teaches at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Nadar University in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. The university is located at the outskirts of Delhi, and Jabin was formerly a researcher and the assistant director of the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. Jabin, over to you.
Thank you, Marion. Let me begin by thanking the Heinrich Stiftung and Marion and her team for this invitation, and also for putting together this stellar cast of speakers that we have today. As Marion just said, I focus or specialize on Chinese politics and foreign policy. So, in the context of this theme, I might look like one of the odd ones out here, but also earlier in our little presentation, Marion referred to China. And I think China serves as some sort of a mirror or benchmark increasingly as far as infrastructure development in India goes. In fact, like in China, infrastructure and development or infrastructure development seems to have been elevated to some sort of a religion or an immutable truth, where the development paradigm is unquestionable or unchallenged or unchallengeable. And I think this particular panel will force us to think. This infrastructure dossier, in fact, that the HPS is bringing out will force us to rethink certain assumptions that we make about infrastructure development in this country, and of the useful lessons and cautionary tales that China offers by way of all that can go wrong in terms of infrastructure development, environmental destruction, marginalization and exclusion, and also a very problematic political economy in that country. So that's just a very brief introduction from my side of the context, or perhaps a useful context to the set of presentations from the three speakers. Let me begin by introducing each of our speakers. Rajni Bakshi is in the order of that we have today. Rajni Bakshi is the first speaker. She's an author, speaker, and founder of the online platform Ahimsa Conversations. Her book, an important book of ours, is Bazaar's Conversations in Freedom for Market Culture Beyond Greed and Fear. The second speaker that we have today is Kanchi Kohli, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Research. She works on issues of law, resource politics, and environment governance in India. Our third speaker is Dolly Kikon, who's a senior lecturer in anthropology and development studies at the University of Melbourne. She focuses on issues of food justice and gender issues in the northeast of India. Each speaker has 7 to 8 minutes in this first round that we will have. And let me just announce for the audience that you can put in your questions in the Q&A box that Zoom provides, and we'll collect the questions at the end. And unfortunately, we do not have the option of getting people to say their questions out loud here. We'll just take the questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and we'll address them to the speakers at the end of the session. Rajni, let me start with you. Rajni is going to be speaking on her paper for the infrastructure dossier, which is titled For an Alternative Paradigm of Development. Over to you, Rajni.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jabin. And thank you to all the friends at Heinrich Stiftung. It's an honor. So namaskar and good morning, good evening, depending on wherever anybody is. Okay, so it's given or it's taken as read that sustainable infrastructure is now the big buzzword along with the, it's a subset of the SDGs. And to interrogate this, to me, at the any time over this last decade and certainly going forward, what it means to interrogate this is to question growth. Now, why? Around us that living systems are in chaotic retreat. And at the same time, many billion people on the planet are still lacking in basic needs. Their basic needs are yet to be met. So in that context, I understand that many people feel very offended by my suggesting that the degrowth framework is the only relevant one now. And yet, here is why I think it is the relevant frame. It is perhaps the only frame that we can work with, because degrowth is not a recession. It is not economic decline. Degrowth, in the Hindi term for it that has been used in the global discourse of this, around this term, the Indian term is Sarvodaya, which literally means the well-being of all. The African equivalent of degrowth is Ubuntu, which means you are, therefore I am. And the Latin American equivalent is Buen Vivir, the good life. Now, what is the problem that we are faced with in relation to this discussion on infrastructure? Well, one is that all the SDGs together simply cannot be met. Something will have to give. And this is partly because those who do indeed live sustainably are still considered undeveloped and backward. The other factor that I'll deal with is that what it means. I mean, I'll try to say a little bit about what it means to look at degrowth as development. Now, if some of you may have seen, the UNEP did a task, it did a handbook for policymakers on sustainable infrastructure, consumption and production parts of it. And the cover story, or rather the cover picture on that document is of an elderly woman, probably somewhere in Northeast India, spinning on a charkha. Okay. Now, she is therefore perhaps satisfying goal 12, which is sustainable consumption and production. She is also satisfying SDG 11, which is inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable livelihood. But there is one problem that comes up, and which is SDG 8, which is that it is decent work and economic growth. Now, the lifestyle which is represented and the work livelihood pattern that is represented in that photo is one that is closer to the notion of degrowth, which mainly is this. Don't get thrown by the term degrowth, which I know it has been called a bomb word, but let's just get beyond the drama of the word. Because what it really means is, in a sense, regrowth. And it means that then development is equated with actual well-being, not the GDP figures, which is the standard measure of growth. And by steady state economics being prioritized, we mean systems in which growth may be an outcome of some level, but it's not a survival imperative. So you're not living with the idea that if you're not growing, you're dying. Then the other factor is that within this framework, it becomes much more conducive to foster a solidarity economy, in which sharing and cooperation are themselves signals of development, rather than being seen as something that have to be pasted on or just be an add-on. And consumption is then reconfigured to make more judicious use of resources with laws and social pressure to discourage and prevent business models that deliberately foist planned obsolescence upon societies and entire economies. But the most crucial element of this framework is that value is then redefined, not to be limited to the money equivalent. In other words, value has to be decoupled from its monetary associations, and it has to be anchored in actual social, physical, ecological well-being, which, as we know, very often is not the case. I have, I think, about 2 minutes left. So I will just close here by giving two areas of possible attention. I mean, that we can give closer attention to later in the discussion. One is the concept of 100-mile communities, which the founder of Seva, Ila Bhatt, has highlighted. Her book, in fact, is called Anubandh. The other dimension that I'd like to emphasize is water. Water, more than anything else, has brought home the absurdity of equating development with GDP growth, because I live in the state of Maharashtra, where already in many years in a row, as early as December or January, meaning just barely 4 months after the monsoon, there is a huge water crisis. And this is the state in which there has been the most extensive and expensive investment in water infrastructure. So I'll pause here because I don't want to overstretch my time by just highlighting some elements of the water. What are going to be the key issues that we could look at more closely? One, when we look at regrowth in the context of water, we have to look at how more scientific work is showing that merely improving water efficiency is not enough. It is far more important, if not imperative, to map how a business or development project affects the wider environment, which is upstream, downstream, and under the ground. Two, that the degrowth discourse can build upon many aspects of the UNEP's efforts to decouple water from GDP growth, because we know that they have otherwise been sort of joined at the hip. Three, the biggest hope for a dynamic regrowth water discourse is to creatively sift needs from wants. And this, I know, is a complicated topic. The honoring the wants of people is an important democratic issue. It's an egalitarian concern that we who have enjoyed the benefits of conventional or old style development have no right to, question anybody's difference, how anybody defines their needs. There are ways in which we can address this that are creative and democratic, and I hope we can do that later in the course of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rajni. That's exactly on time. So without further ado, let me move to the next speaker, Kanchi Kohli from CPR, who is going to be speaking to us on the topic that she wrote for the dossier, which is historical injustice and bogus claims, large infrastructure conservation, and forest rights in India. Over to you, Kanchi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity to be able to actually relook at what one put together for the dossier, and also, engage with those questions and topics before I could, speak about them today. So thank you very much and thank you for everybody to join in today and listen in, and look forward to the discussion later on. Let me start by just, in October last year, October 2021, several hundreds of Adivasi villagers from Hasdewaran forest area in central India, in Chhattisgarh, walked almost 300 kilometers to the state capital, talking about something very fundamental. They were talking about upholding their constitutional right to govern. They were talking about the need to conserve the Hasdewaran forest, not just for themselves, but for important flagship wildlife species. They were talking about the water of Hasdev River. They were talking about all the reasons why Hasdewaran should be protected for good climate futures, for a whole bunch of reasons. They were talking about this because Hasdewaran is actually home to them. They were also a recognition that Hasdewaran is an area which is one of the largest contiguous, unfragmented forest areas of the country. But I think one of the things that they were really concerned about also was that constitutional and legal processes through which democratic decision-making could take place for areas like Hasdewaran had been seriously vitiated. 6 years back, one of the villages in Hasdewaran, after the recognition of their community forest rights, their community forest rights were actually cancelled. When the law, community forest rights recognized under India's Forest Rights Act, was cancelled, even though and despite the fact that neither the law nor any statutory procedure prescribes for something like this. This case is in court, all of that was happening, but simultaneously, they were surprised with the fact that how is it that a legally recognized right is cancelled, giving reason that the exercise of your right is coming in the way of mining. That's the reason given for the cancellation of the right, when actually legally there is no scope for something like this. Now, the reason I flag this is because the story of Hasdewaran is important in itself, but it's also representative of, and it also reflects the complexities of forest governance in India at one level, and also the serious conflicts around the recognition of forest rights in India. And this is why it's important to link and understand Hasdewaran also in the context of, the fact that although there are many such burning issues across the country, this is becoming, it is, in fact, in some ways, it's routine and increasing at this point of time. But there's a very important flashpoint when cases like Hasdeoran became very crucial. The flashpoint was of 2019, when the Supreme Court of India actually ordered, saying that and this was in a case where the constitutional validity of the Forest Rights Act was under question, where the Supreme Court ordered that all people whose rights had not been recognized and vested and recorded should be evicted. And this was in reaction to the fact that there was evidence provided that there are lots of bogus claims. There was genuine concern by petitioners in this case that there was a problem. But what this meant was that a case like this would club all rejection cases, including for villages in Hasdeoran, where there would be forged cases. There would be definitely cases of bogus claims, but there would also be cases where people have been, recognition of rights processes have been politically motivated, or rejections have taken place for different reasons than, in areas definitely where economic expansion, infrastructure expansion is planned. So all those kinds of multiple reasons by which rights already recognized have been rejected, or rights have not been genuinely recorded, and all those kinds of things was taking place. Now, although this case, the allegedly due to high level political intervention, the evictions in this case have been held back, and the processes are on. But I think in the contribution to this dossier, I was trying to to talk about these two instances and this ongoing struggle in Hasdeo, as well as the Supreme Court case, to be able to, basically talk about three facets of large infrastructure conservation and forest rights in India. First was about the issues of community ownership versus the state's right to divert or acquire lands. Even though forest rights processes for recognition of forest rights, especially community forest rights, allow for very important governance, management, and use rights, ownership, it does not necessarily vest ownership with people. So, and it does not take away this eminent domain powers of the government to be able to acquire land. So that is why in judicial responses, by the government, it is statements like, if I have the right to switch on a right, I have the right to also switch it off. So you actually claim something like that. Government is able to stake a claim for something like that. So that was one facet that the paper tries to highlight. The article tries to highlight. The other is about the differentiation between recognition of rights and settlement of claims. While the recognition, the historical injustice background of the Forest Rights Act is talking about undoing the historical injustice through a recognition of rights of tribal and other forest dwelling communities. The government often treats this as a bureaucratic process to settle claims before the land can be put for other economic uses or other uses. So it's like a administrative bureaucratic exercise. And the third aspect and facet that I was trying to look at in the article is about the binaries of wildlife versus tribal, and that is increasingly becoming those tensions are really becoming really big, including in the Supreme Court case, because of the huge pressures of infrastructure and expansion in forest areas, the demand for forest areas for macroeconomic sectors. So I think those were the three big areas that the article discusses. And basically, it looks at how do you distinguish between genuine and bogus claims? How do you actually ensure that even if delocation or display or acquisition processes have to be undertaken, then they're not forced, and all those kinds of the questions it raises. So, but these are political questions, and the concern is that cases like in the Supreme Court, where judicial orders are pronounced, these political questions cannot be resolved by knee-jerk judicial directions, especially in a regulatory environment where economic sector imperatives trump all constitutional and legal safeguards, which are essential for democratic decision-making in the country. And I'll end there, and I look forward to responses, feedback, questions, and just discussing this with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanchi, once again on the dot. So Dolly, as a third speaker, that leaves you under some pressure because your fellow panelists have been on the dot. So over to you, Dolly. Dolly's presentation paper for the dossier was on gendering infrastructure in the Northeast. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So this is a paper I wrote in 2019. And I think some of the conversations I shared in the essay I wrote for the Heinrich Bowl was on infrastructure and gendering. And I drew a lot from my engagement and also what was happening around in the Northeast in terms of conversations at the time. So if I'm looking at the paper, just I think for our friends who are, kind of like wondering about the perspective, this is an essay that I kind of broke into 4 sections. So I started the paper with a perspective on infrastructure and what that meant in terms of our understandings about the tangible things around us, and a perspective from the region. The second section that I focused on here in this paper was about connecting infrastructure to gender, and why is a gender framework important for us to think about infrastructure from the Northeast. The third aspect that I wanted to focus here was the Look East and the Act East policy, and how both the policies actually centrally dwell on development and also infrastructure being a very, very central theme, and connecting the region to its Southeast Asian neighborhood. From there, what I did was actually get into connecting infrastructure, gendered experiences, and dwelling on reflections. Why is it that when we say perhaps that infrastructure and the development of roads, dams, destroy, how is it that it also brings a buzz and kind of an aspiration that people always aspire to be connected through roads? And even now, as we are talking, there are these huge road projects across Nagaland, Manipur. They say that the road towards Moray is even getting better, and there's kind of a buzz that happens. So with the coming of a road, how does lives change? And I think there's a lot of good literature out there that people are writing and talking about. So I will not waste my time, because I'll leave it to the amazing researchers to inform us. I, around that time, was reading Walter Benjamin, and I was really inspired about his idea of the spectacle. And I took on his concept of phantasmagoria. And I was wondering, and you might wonder, how is it that I was connecting Paris, right? The coming of these expositions and the excitement that was there, and the coming of light, electricity, to something like the Northeast. And I think that's what development does. It brings a buzz across villages, right? And that's something we can't ignore. I've been an anthropologist, and I think as an ethnographer, I'm always kind of intrigued by why is it that as human beings, the things that kills us also excites us the most. And the poorest of the poor who work in the coal mines in Meghalaya, in Nagaland, my first book was on mining, are drawn towards that. And I don't want to romanticize it. Neither do I want to fetishize it. But it's to do with really poverty, and it's to do with the criminalization of hope and an aspiration of the poor in the absence of the state, right? So for a lot of the villages around Nagaland, Oting just happened last month. There were coal miners, and the money that they would have saved would have actually gone towards the schools and the hostels. They wouldn't have built a building or bought a flat in Delhi, Nana, right? It would have gone to buy basic medicine. And I think it really makes us wonder about infrastructure and what it is doing and where we are going with this development conversation. So I was thinking a lot regarding gender infrastructure at that time. And I began to wonder, I think, like Rajni, whether there's a term on infrastructure, and I can find an equivalent in my mother tongue, Lotha. There is none. For us, then, infrastructure is almost synonymous with development. When they talk about roads, they don't say infrastructure. They say, oh, you know, we need development. If you ask what kind, they say we need a road to the village. And I think a road should be a basic right of a citizen, right? It should not be shrouded in kind of a language of development. It brings us back to the vicious cycle of remoteness and what needs to be connected, perhaps a remote region like the Northeast. The other thing that I was looking at in this essay was also the look east and the act east. And at that time, I started looking at both the policies, and I realized that as a researcher, I was just looking around. I was neither looking east nor acting east. I was just looking around. And what I saw was that a lot of women here are visible in the Northeast across sector, from the farms to, you know, being vendors to taking care of houses, households, yet they're very invisible in the decision-making traditional bodies. And why is that? This visibility and invisibility works together. And the third thing that I discovered was that with the coming of development for, say, roads, what changed? For instance, a tangible material thing like a bridge that connects a village which never had a bridge before to a railway station. We found out with our activists on the ground that the increasing number of migration that were taking place were actually women and females who were going out of the village to search for work. That was also completely transforming the social relations back in the village, in the family, because a lot of these migrant women would save money, but once they came back to the village, were unable to find a groom or were unable to get married because there was a stigma for women, single women who migrated. So in that sense of perhaps I began to think, along with a lot of practitioners here, that there was a paradox, however, that in villages as well, in the towns across the Northeast, the absence of infrastructure then did not deter, right, any kind of trade that was going on. And I think the pandemic is a good example, and hill states, small hill states like Nagaland, is a good example that people in the hills actually did not starve. And it was because of the forest. And it was because of this sustainable kind of understanding with nature that they were inhabiting. So in terms of plants, in terms of herbs, villages were sharing. And I think it tells us a lot about not only trade, local economy, but also community infrastructure and how important it is actually to bring back the forest, to bring back local practices in conversations about infrastructure. And in a sense, I think since 2019, I transitioned into my new work on food justice movement and infrastructure here in the region. And in fact, I just came out of a workshop, an entire workshop with Monoram Gogoi and others, like Father Walter Fernandez, who have been working for decades on community, customary law, forest rights, food security. And I think the conversation to include forests, to include animals, to include the ecosystem in understanding infrastructure becomes really important. One of the things that development and infrastructure conversations do in a region like Northeast is to erase, right? The erasure is both people, experiences, community, and along with that, all the animals, for instance, and the plants and the biodiversity that comes along with it. So I feel that we can have maybe more conversations, but I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dolly. So let me thank all three speakers for sticking to the time. Very, very important. Before we start the discussion, let me once again remind the audience to please send in your questions in the Q&A box. Let me now briefly touch on what I think were the three broad themes to this discussion. And I found it very interesting that the speakers often overlapped with each other in terms of these themes. One, I think Rajni Bakshi started off with the idea of redefining or rethinking infrastructure and development. Dolly Kikon's presentation also referred to this element of how the Northeast, basic things like roads or bridges is seen as a big give from the government instead of being treated as basic services, right? But it's also interesting that Kanchi and Dolly also, and Dolly, by the way, is a former lawyer. So this legal aspect, I think, is something that's very interesting that we often ignore in terms of our understanding of infrastructure development process. I think this legal element is particularly germane to our understanding or our approach to infrastructure development in India. This is something that is often seen, particularly, this is where I think India ought to be standing out very differently and sharply from China, right? China also says it has laws and legal processes, but the way the law is used in China is quite different, or it's at least the way the law is used should be used in India should be quite different from the way it is used in China. And yet, I think what comes through from Kanchi's discussion, of Kanchi's presentation, is that maybe there are far too many similarities for us to be comfortable with in India, between India and China on this legal side of things. Third, I think, again, this is something that overlaps perhaps among all three presentations, is the excuse of remoteness or periphery as a way of steamrolling or pushing forward development of a certain kind. In a sense, there's a degree of marginalization and exclusion that comes through both in Rajni, in Dolly's and Kanchi's presentations, where this is seen as simply excuse enough or reason enough to impose a development paradigm as quickly as possible, because, well, guys, it's all for your good. That sort of that's the sort of attitude that seems to go around in government offices. So with those few remarks, let me start off with an opening question to Rajni. Is Rajni still here? Okay, yes. So Rajni, I mean, you've been associated with the Gandhi Smriti and the Darshan Samiti, and so one of the things that stood out for me right in your opening remarks was these different concepts that you introduced: Sarvodaya, Ubuntu. And it occurred to me, really, while you're challenging notions of sustainable development, it occurred to me the principal problem is that there isn't really a platform or a forum in which there's a global South approach to sustainable development. So there needs to be a global South approach to redefining concepts of development. So I suppose my question to you is, why has this not really happened? Or how feasible is this approach or this call for redefining development, given the nature of international politics, international political economy, the way it is?
Yeah. So, Jabin, I think actually it did happen to a large extent, from, I would say, the early 90s, which is why the Narmada Bachao Andolan became a global iconic movement, which was inspirational actually to similar struggles across the world. It is not an accident that the first time that the World Social Forum met outside of Brazil, it met in India, which was 2004. So I think, in fact, the question to ask is, why are we today, despite these many, many rich and intense mobilizations, why are we still where we are? And I think I'll just dwell a bit on what you said about the legal aspects, that I think we are losing the battle, the battle of the spirit of the law more than the letter of the law. So let me highlight it. Since I mentioned Narmada, I'll highlight it through an example that it was legal for the people of Mani Bailey. Mani Bailey was the first village immediately upstream of the Sardar Sarovar Dam. Okay, it was so close that at night you could see the huge glaring, the big halogen lights at the dam site. And the people at Moneybelly kept saying, they said, see, all these years you never gave us a school, you never gave us a road, we never complained. But now whatever we have also you are taking. And that is supposed to be legal, and not giving me the school and not giving me the road for these. But at that time it was 60 years after independence, right? That is legal. So this violation of the spirit of the Human Rights Charter and the Indian Constitution, I'm afraid for that we have to look at the enormous concentration of power that has happened additionally over the last 20 years. And that is why many of the people who put their activists and professionals and various kinds of people in all walks of life, you know, who really put their might behind this South-South redefinition of development. I think this is why today many of them feel, you know, so stumped. I'm sorry to sound a pessimistic note, because I hope I'll have a chance later to balance that out.
Thank you, Rajni. It sort of reminded me that a long time ago in my master's, one of the works, little thesis that I wrote up was comparing the Narmada Dam development with the Three Gorges project in China, roughly contemporaneous, and the way the two governments engaged in the resettlement process for the two communities. And again, sorry to say, but there were quite a lot of similarities in the approaches. Even though, of course, in India, the movement continued for quite a while. So let me now move to Kanchi. So Kanchi, again, for the audience, let me sort of recommend Kanchi's Twitter page, where she has a fantastic thread under the hashtag Law for All, where she talks a great deal about the interaction of law and environmental governance in India. And I think it's a very, very insightful thread, which I recommend everyone to sort of look at. So Kanchi, you know, you refer to several interesting and important concepts: eminent domain, the sort of juggle between eminent domain versus community forest rights, recognition of rights versus the settlement of claims, and the fact that all of this goes about in a very administrative, bureaucratic manner for the government. Now, on the one hand, I think Rajni referred to this, you know, the lack of implementation of legal provisions on water, right? There are clear laws laid out on the use of water for industrial purposes, etc. in India, but these are not these are laws observed in the breach rather than actually being followed. You also talked about the violation of community forest rights and the legal challenge that forest rights have faced in India. I suppose the question to you is, but on the other hand, you've also talked about coercive environmentalism, where the court decides to get into the act of enforcing a degree of environmentalism. So it seems that the court decides to be selective in this. So where really is the problem of balance here? I mean, why is there a certain lack of balance in this entire exercise? Kanchi.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have the answer of why there's a lack of balance, but I think I'll try and I'll definitely try and I think it's a very significant and very important question, which actually focuses directly on the judiciary. And I think I would definitely like to say that judicial environmentalism, whether in an unanticipated or unanticipated, deliberate or naive manner, actually has contributed and is actually implicated in a lot of decisions that have led to social and environmental injustices. And I think for a very long time, and there's a lot of literature and scholarship on this as well. There's a lot of flagship cases in India which have actually led to created newer injustices. So I think while judicial interventions and judicial processes are extremely crucial, definitely, and it's a right of citizens to access the judiciary, especially when the state fails, which is what is happening, say, in the Ghatbarra case that I spoke about, or many other cases where the judiciary is invoked. It's a very crucial space, or where legal questions have to be actually resolved. It's very crucial. But I think judiciary cannot be, and maybe perhaps should not be, the place where complex questions of governance are addressed and are looked at. So you can't necessarily be overseeing long-standing, whether point by point how each forest, whether every claim under the Forest Rights Act is bogus or not bogus. So these are the kinds of complexities that come up in judicial processes. And I think courts, by their design, are expert driven, they're exclusionary, they are, the power is in the hands of a few. So there is a huge political economy of courts. So that's why questions of governance in courts is automatically marginalizes those who can't speak up in court. I mean, there's absolutely exclusionary processes. So I think judiciary definitely has to uphold the law. Judicial environmentalism has to be, at the same time, judicial environmentalism has to be extremely responsible, conscious of the fact that you're not, in the decisions and the deliberations, you're not creating newer injustices while you're trying to address some legal question.
Kanchi, I'm going to push you a little bit there. Essentially, what you're saying is there's a certain abdication of the political process, which forces the judiciary to step in and then perhaps take on tasks that the judiciary is actually not qualified for. Would that be a good way of characterizing perhaps not just environmental governance, but a whole bunch of other issues?
At one level, yes, but there's also, when you're talking about judicial activism, when powerful decide to administer justice that they would like to administer, I think there is a lot of, that may have different sorts of motivations as well. So I don't think it's only at the time where the state fails. It's when the power elite also get together and work with the judiciary to make certain decisions happen. So I think there are a whole bunch of, there's a lot of legal scholarship that actually discusses some of these questions. So I think there is a whole bunch of, so that's why I spoke about the judicial processes being extremely exclusionary and they stand in stark contrast to democratic decision making that should take place outside the court. So that's why complex questions can't be dealt with there.
Yeah. Thank you, Kanchi. I think those are very important issues which I think we'll have to face more and more if we are a country of the rule of law as opposed to rule by law, as the case in China is. And please forgive me, as a China person, I'm going to bring in China every now and then. I try not to, but it's inevitable that it comes in. So, Dolly, over to you. A lot of legal questions. I think I'm sure you'll have a few things to say about that as well. But what I'd like to sort of take you up on is essentially questions of marginalization and exclusion, and some of your more recent work on farmers' community rights, and justice in this realm. So, a question on this is really, the state in India is really overwhelming in terms of what it wants to do. Right? Its definition of a paradigm of development. It's telling people not just rhetorically or in political statements, but also by way of legal processes, laws, economic processes, subsidies for farming, etc., that this is a development paradigm you follow. And increasingly in India, I think there's a dependence of farming communities on state-driven, state-built, state-sponsored infrastructure. Is this affecting agency? Since you study farming communities, and of course this has an impact on questions of gender as well. Clearly it is to an extent, but what is the trend? Where is it going, and how do we arrest this, if this is actually problematic or undermining farming communities or the agency of marginalized and excluded groups? I'm sorry, it's a pretty large question, but I think...
That's a really good question. And suddenly I feel that I'm kind of going to channel the conversations that I had this afternoon here in this meeting. And it also shows the amazing connectivity of how all of us, different forums, are actually thinking along the same lines. Basically, the Northeast, majority of the farmers are marginal farmers because landholding is small. And that means that the kind of subsidies that I think rural farmers are getting, that according to activists, is money and rice as subsidy. And in a sense, that's really changing society and mainly want to do with land relations and land now as an asset and what you can do with it. So maybe you can lease it, you can do cash crop here, I mean monocropping. And I think it's really, really changing. And what you said about India being a really, really large country and looking at state structures in India, I think we really have to say that one policy for the entire country, especially when it comes to farming, is a disaster. Right? The seasons are different. Here in the Northeast, by 3:30, it's dark. So you can imagine just the kind of time zones we have. The tea plantations have a different time zone even now. So there's a plantation time and there's an outside plantation time. And so for marginal farmers, I think in terms of following one policy fits all is really a big challenge. And secondly, it also means that marginal farmers here don't get loans because they have nothing to show as collateral when it comes. I mean, they hardly have any land or in terms of any property. So it becomes very challenging. And I think the third part that we need to remember is that how do we look at perhaps the 5th schedule or the 6th schedule, which is here in the autonomous states in Assam. Nagaland is under Article 371A, where in terms of natural resources and land custodianship is different. So coming to the point of maybe linking the legal provisions and development, and particularly to do with natural resources, I think we have to come to an agreement that state-wise it needs to be different. The last point that I need to make is that we have to take ecology and then climate change as a reality. No amount of building roads in the upstate, upper elevations of the Eastern Himalayas is going to help anyone. Every year, no matter how good the roads are, there's going to be a landslide. The road between Dimapur and Kohima is washed away every summer in the torrential monsoon rain. Parts of Arunachal totally cut off. And that's when communities come up and build their own infrastructure. Like, I think there was a question on the Living Root Bridge. That is indigenous infrastructure. How does it then enter policies that we need to be thinking about it together? And the last point, I think, talking about law in India, we really have to, I feel, give emphasis on indigenous jurisprudence, on customary jurisprudence as a point where we look at that law as something that's living, right? Living law. And I think the point of contention that's here, I want to go back to Kanchi's point, is really the tribal and the animal kind of conflict. And here, conservation conversations in India can be absolutely out of touch with the reality on the ground. And perhaps that is where maybe we need to really think about indigenous jurisprudence, where for the longest time, I grew up with stories where my kin and my ancestors were animals and trees as well. But I wasn't allowed to feel like that at all in schools, in colleges. People would think I'm mad, right? So the kind of structural and pedagogical violence that we have done to education, to understanding of this kind of knowledge system that we have, I think needs to be revisited and needs to be brought in forums like that. So thanks for asking me that question.
Thank you, Dolly. There are a lot of things to unpack there, to consider there. I mean, first and foremost, of course, is a federal question. The fact that India has these multiple states with not just multiple political diversities, but also environmental and geographical diversities, which are simply not taken into account in a one-size-all-fits development paradigm. It often requires a great deal of pushback from the communities directly affected in order for the state to take note. And that, I think, is one of the objectives that we are trying with this infrastructure dossier, this examination of infrastructure and all its different facets, that, this is a complex exercise that requires much more attention to the fine granular detail on the ground. And this collection of authors that we have, or speakers that we have here, as well as the authors in the overall, in the larger dossier, I think underline these points. So I see that we have a lot of questions already. So let me, without further ado, get to the questions. So I'm going to take the first two questions are actually to Rajni. So from Shubha Chako, there's a question about how concepts like Sarvodaya address inequalities within communities based on religion, caste, gender, sexuality. It's a pretty large question, but let me add one more to it. How do we embed? This is from Rakesh Kalshian. He's he's in charge of the overall dossier. How do you embed the idea of degrowth in mainstream politics, which is irrevocably beholden to the idea of economic growth? This is something that, Rajni, you underlined in questions of SDG. So can the state be persuaded about the desirability of this view? Well, through parliamentary and institutional politics. Or do we need to create social and political movements to push for this change? Again, Rajni, that's a pretty big question. And as somebody who's experienced in all of these areas, that's for you to answer. So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
So there are two very different questions. Thank you, Shubha. I'm sorry, I missed the name of the second friend.
Rakesh. Yeah.
Rakesh. So let's take Shubha's question first. It is a very difficult thing. In practice, what would be the mechanics of addressing the equity question? I would only say this, that it is a question that is never going to be solved, which does not mean that we stop working on it, but it is by definition going to be a work in progress, perhaps indefinitely. Why? Because the situation is necessarily inevitably always dynamic. And it is in the nature of the human condition that for every one problem we solve, we create 2 or 3 new ones. So I would just say that as long as all we can be committed to is to constantly re-examining that question of equity and doing it from a very flexible and a very overarching kind of framework, because as we are seeing, the digital age is giving us a huge paradox where, and it's to do with infrastructure also, at least digital infrastructure, where on the upfront, the interface, the consumer or the user interface looks very democratic. It looks vastly participative. Yet we know that the back office is unprecedented control of power and the technology. So I will only say this, that it's a dynamic problem which we'll have to keep addressing in multiple ways. Rakesh, on your question about, how do you bring this in? Well, one is, I think, why can't Sarvodaya be a political objective? See, in fact, it's far more powerful than a concept like Atmanirbhar. But let's not go down that track. To cut a long story short, I think there is no hope unless there is a shift at the global level. And this is where I feel that the so-called developed countries do have to take a lead. And the activist communities in the rest of the so-called developed world have to take a lead. We have to abolish the GDP as a measure of progress or of growth or of anything. As long as the GDP and the Human Development Index remain two separate verticals, there is no hope. And there have been some tentative baby steps. I mean, at one stage, many leading global thinkers were showing interest in this. There has been a lot of noise about the Bhutan's, human happiness index, etc. But I'm afraid it's not gone anywhere. And so, unless this is something that will have to first shift at the global level for it to gain credibility at home, sadly, that is the truth. As I see it, I hope I'm wrong. I would be delighted if I'm wrong, and we can do it on our own.
Okay. So, a question to Kanchi from Richard Harkinson, who's engaged pretty deeply with development issues in rural communities in India. So this is to do with the Hasdeo Arand forest communities. So the question is really, well, it's a rather complex question for somebody of my limited abilities in this field, but it's about the complexities in terms of litigation, as described by another author, Mayank Agarwal, in the two SC civil writ suits. And there's a reference to the Mongabe article. So, Kanchi, if you can, if you have understood this question, perhaps you could talk about this. And maybe I'll just add one more question. There is a question from Ayushi Malhotra on FRA. So where Ayushi thinks that the depth of the problem lies in how the FRA remains at the cusp of legislature, executive and judicial operation in India, as well as various department portfolios that deal with development. But it's essentially a problem of implementation. So she wants to know, where do you see this going in the coming times, and is there hope for some resolution under the ambit of the FRA? Over to you, Kanchi.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will need to read Mayank's piece more in detail. But I think with respect to Hasdeo, there are, I think the litigation has been a very long-standing one. There've been, I mean, starting with the National Green Tribunal to the Supreme Court to the High Court, there are lots of judicial processes that are underway, and they have some progressive orders that have also come in especially in the National Green Tribunal order judgment that came in. However, I think what is interesting in the Hasdeo Arand case is that despite the pendency of those cases, the bureaucratic and administrative processes of opening up Hasdeo Arand for mining have continued. So it's almost like you create a fait accompli sort of situation during the pendency of those cases. And I think that is a question that requires extreme, very crucial reconciliation at some given point of time, because you cannot have permissions, legal permission or statutory permissions that continue to say, well, this statutory permission is subject to the outcome of the Supreme Court case. You know, I mean, what is the purpose of a Supreme Court case or a High Court case when the area is opened up, people are displaced, mineral is extracted, all of that. That question needs to be resolved upfront. Legal processes have to go through in detail, and only then, if required, and if the processes have been followed, and due consent has been received through the processes under law. I think those are then you talk about opening up the space. Here it's like, okay, we'll look at this later, and then we carry on. The judicial processes can the outcome of the judicial processes can wait, even though the bureaucratic paperwork continues. So there is that discrepancy that is taking place in Hasdeo Arand, and I think it's a very live question right now, which is being raised. I haven't read that other question, but I think, so FRA actually is a very, very crucial piece of legislation. I think it's a crucial piece of legislation because it is, in fact, the Forest Rights Act came in because historically, and especially post-independence India, the questions of forest land, forest rights have remained unresolved. I mean, repeatedly have remained unresolved. Governments after governments have not been able to, whether it's state government, central government, have not been able to address that question adequately. The coming in of the Forest Conservation Act, the Supreme Court case, Godavarman case, which actually took charge of forest policy and governance in India. All of them actually are very crucial backgrounds of why the Forest Rights Act became an important piece of legislation. It's important because its preamble recognizes historical injustice. But Forest Rights Act also has its limits as a piece of legislation. Forest Rights Act it can secure record rights of certain kinds, but it does not necessarily ensure. It cannot legally take away the powers of the state to acquire that land again. So I think those are very important questions that we need to keep alive. Yet the Forest Rights Act has been for a country like India extremely important tool for many people for political mobilization, because it's a very concrete thing around which you could communities actually can hold on to and secure something. So whether it is securing an asset which you want to negotiate with, or you want to actually have a seat at the table to actually talk about decision making in the place you belong to. So it's a concrete hold for lots of forest dwelling communities. And I think that is why you also see the kinds of reactions that you're seeing with respect to the Forest Rights Act. So I think it's a very, very important piece of legislation. It has historical background, and it definitely has a very important political future. I don't think we can wish away the Forest Rights Act, immediately at all.
Thank you, Kanchi. The next two questions are for Dolly. They're small, short questions, but they're pretty complex. The first one is from Ranjan Panda, who says, there's a question about the perception of indigenous youth towards infrastructure. But the catch in the question is really, how do we stop them from getting distracted by the promises of destructive infrastructure? I think that's a pretty complicated business in the sense that, how are they to assess that this is destructive infrastructure if infrastructure itself is sold as a sort of a solution to everything, right? The other question is from Longnam Kharpuri, who is from Meghalaya, and he has a question about whether it is the case that elected governments in the Northeast are key to progressive, well-informed and researched decisions being made about infrastructure development. I think the catch here is again, that elected governments are themselves part of the problem in many cases, right? There's a certain political economy, for example, in extractive industries, in the building of dams, that elected governments cutting across, or even political parties cutting across affiliations are a part of. So two questions for you, Dolly.
Thank you so much. I'm checking the questions, and Rakesh has a question on science and technology. Can I take that?
I thought we could take it in the next round.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the first question that I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, is about destructive infrastructure and how people can stay away from that. I think infrastructure is infrastructure, right? We need that. Let's admit we need hospitals, we need schools. I'm speaking in English, and thank God for schools in Nagaland, where I grew up and I studied. And that's why I'm here. My mother could go to office, in a bus, and perhaps that's why I'm here. I'm educated enough that I'm here. I think infrastructure is infrastructure, and the thing is that we need it. We need it as human society. We need to survive. We need medicine. But what becomes destructive, perhaps, is then, are big dams important? Is it relevant that you erase an entire mountain to construct a dam so that you can give electricity to maybe, industries in Gujarat? How relevant is that? How do we understand what is destructive and what is not if existing inequalities increase once bridges come, once there are roads? I think that's a paradox that we need to think about. The second question about elected governments in Northeast India, that's really interesting. And I think it's tied to mainstream politics in India as such. The Northeastern states altogether, I think, don't even give around 50 parliamentarians, MPs in the Indian Parliament. And we count on, I think, numbers. So when it comes to governments in the Northeast, they have to sway with, I think, the mainstream political party that's there at the center. And so I feel that things change here in the Northeast according to who is in power in Delhi. And that's a reality. I think Meghalaya right now is in deficit. Last year, they were telling them that, you have to perhaps use less electricity. Nagaland, Manipur, I hear that Assam is also in trouble because, they're running out of funds. So that's the reality actually of frontier economy. And that's the reality of the Northeast. So I think just looking at elected governments and where it's going would help, because right now our biggest airport in the region, Guwahati, Gopinath Airport belongs to Adani. And the other news is that the Guwahati Zoo, which is the largest zoo in the region, has been given to Adani last year. And then 2 panthers from there were given to a private Adani zoo. And so that's the reality of the region. So I think we really have to think about this together. These are not answers, but I hope reflection notes.
Okay, thank you. So Dolly, let's also take this science and tech question. This is from Rakesh Kalshan, who asks you if you think science and technology as a prime mover of economic growth has a role to play in reimagining different kinds of infrastructure that are culturally acceptable and appropriate to, say, different ethnic groups in the Northeast. And perhaps I'd like to bring Rajni also into this. I mean, in a sense, science and technology is often seen as a solution, but perhaps there is also a valorization of science and tech without necessarily understanding that there are other consequences to the use or the employment or the privileging of science and tech, right? So first Dolly and then Rajni.
Thanks, Jabin. I think this is a really important question. And hi, Rakesh. How are you, Kalshan? I'll speak to you later. Nice to see you here. He's a very old friend. And so when we talk about science and technology, my mind just goes to the labs and the scientific labs that are there. And that's related to my current food study, I think, on food preservation. A lot of the food preservation technologies around safety, standardization takes place inside scientific labs, in the universities around the region. And I think that's where I feel local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge kind of is erased and it becomes scientific knowledge. Although they take the samples from the communities, let's say fermented bamboo shoot, or let's say fermented dry fish. These are technologies, these are knowledge that communities have for centuries. But once it goes inside the science laboratories, I think there's a huge disconnect that takes place, and entire community knowledge is erased. And I think that's where we need to think about science and technology and the history of science in the context, I feel, of colonialism. And I'm really engaging with this book, which is teaching me a lot. And it's a book called Pollution is Colonialism, written by Max Leboron, who is a scientist himself in an indigenous people headed laboratory in Canada. And I think this entire conversation about science needs to be contextualized with corporations, particularly here in the Northeast, because I feel that one of the earliest science and scientists that we saw in the Northeast were tea scientists, were agronomists with the tea, who came with the tea bush, right? We are geologists who came with the oil. And it becomes very important then, I think, for us to relate how the colonial state actually came to the subcontinent as a company and then became the empire. And then what happens then to regions like the Northeast or, to the tribal belts, for instance? What is the extractive relation that goes on, if nothing else but colonialism? And I think this ongoing relation really gives us new insights. And I think maybe that's where the Adani example would also then be considered in new lights.
Okay, over to you, Rajni.
Yeah. Wow, these are so huge, but I'll take a shot. So maybe the crux, building on what Dolly just said, I would say maybe the crux is, again, if we refer back to Narmada, the issue is not that whether we are going to use technology or not, but that can we find a technological paradigm which is able to maximize the benefit of the river without destroying it as a river. Yes, we have created a massive chain of so-called infrastructure, but we have destroyed the river. Now it is just a sequence of impounding walls. Frail. They are not going to last forever. Okay, so this fundamental thing is, I think, at the heart of the violence that Mahatma Gandhi identified in modernity. It is because it is modernity by definition is short term. It has a short term view of what is beneficial, of what works. And therefore, it's become institutionalized in the knowledge system, that is the science part of it, and that therefore the technological frames which emerge from it. All the colonialism issues which Dolly so accurately highlighted are an add-on to this. But so even if today say we are to do the decision making completely on our own, but if we are not able to free ourselves of that violence that is inherent in this short-termism, then we are as badly off as if we were being ruled by, quote unquote foreigners. So that is the primary thing. And I'll close with one example. I'm not at all in favor of romanticizing anything, either modern technology or traditional technology. But we do need very extensive documentation of what people did on their own for centuries, which worked so beautifully. In the realm of water, we have the brilliant documentation left behind by Anupam Mishra. And in food, I'm sure that friends like Dolly are going to be doing that work, because I have personally seen food grain storage systems in central India, in parts of Madhya Pradesh, which are so secure. They are able to keep grain safe and usable and edible far longer than FCI's go downs, without any pesticides or any toxic chemical elements being introduced into that storage bin. I'll pause with that.
Okay, thank you. So I'm conscious of time. We just have 4 minutes according to the official clock. But this has been such an interesting discussion. So I hope the organizers will excuse us if we go just a little bit over time to take in a few more questions. So what I'm going to do is bunch up the remaining 3 questions. So Abdul Nasir Nazari from Afghanistan has a very interesting question. I think it sort of speaks to that first question I raised to Rajni about the global South approach to sustainable development. So his question is really whether using a simple checklist of compliance with national and international best practices, quote unquote, is sufficient to not cause harm. So what are the lessons that we can draw? I mean, of course, Rajni will say Ubuntu and Sarvodaya, but again, I think the question really is about how do you get to that point? And I think in a country like Afghanistan, this is a serious issue, right? It's a country that is given over to opium farming, environmental destruction, and so on because of the conflict. Preeti Sharma has this, again, it's a related point, which is about the inequality in development across states and societies, where simple aspirations become big asks. And to continue with this question of security, Vidushi Kaushik has this last question, which I think applies, which I'm going to invite all of you to talk about, which is the securitization of the development issue. Whether it's respect, say, with Siachen, with respect to Pakistan, or the Adivasi or Naxalite conflict within central India. I mean, indigenous forest rights in India become quickly matters of conflict in central India or in northeast India, where infrastructure development in Arunachal is part of a competitive process with China. So the securitization of the development debate, and therefore the attempt to refrain from asking or to prevent questions from being raised. How do you deal with this, from each of you in your line of work? So I'm going to start with Rajni, then Kanchi, and Dolly. So yeah, over to you, Rajni.
Should I take a shot at all that?
Well, our time is limited. So how about 2 minutes each? So maybe you can also end up with a concluding remark.
Yeah. And I promise to say something hopeful, because I very firmly committed to the conviction that pessimism is for better times. We simply don't have the luxury. Okay. And see, I would like to maybe close by quoting from Emery Lovins and Paul Hawken's famous book, Natural Capitalism, in which they did a whole chapter which is called Nature Bats Last and It Owns the Stadium. Having said that, it is also true that all life subsists on some form of life. Since I'm very much preoccupied with the question of what is nonviolence these days, this to me has become the most, people ask me, what is the nutshell that I've learned in 2 years of doing this work? It is that we cannot attempt to define nonviolence in very absolutist terms, because then we'll do a great disservice. We'll make it impossible. So do no harm, again, has to be understood with a dynamic and a egalitarian commitment to finding a constant rebalancing act. Balance is by definition, if it's static, it's not balance, right? Then it's stagnation, and we do need dynamism. So I would say that it has to be constantly re-examined, and there are many ways of doing it in our own individual and micro lives. The big unknown is, how do we counter the large macro structural violence, which my other two friends have so well highlighted, whether it's the legal aspect or the other political economy aspects, which and actually I would have loved to hear from you, Jabin, because you have hinted at it. That's the real elephant in the room, especially when we talk about China. And so that, I think, is a topic for a whole different webinar.
I'll try, Rajni, but first I'm going to ask Kanchi to speak.
I'm going to just quickly wrap it up so that you get more time. I mean, all I'll just say is that, the post-liberalization India actually had, and globally also, this question came up, that there was this promise that the good science and use of law can actually deliver a great package for sustainable development. And I think this, in the context of securitization, in the context of rise of authoritarianism globally, both science and law are out of the picture. The reasons why decisions are taken, actually, whether it's governments taking decisions or the space to ask questions or the forums of participation and consent, all are become compromised. And in that, actually, this is a complete collapse of that dream that was offered in post-liberalization India. So I think what you're seeing right now is in places that have been securitized for all kinds of reasons. For instance, in mining geographies, people are making choices all the time of alliances, of of negotiations of different kinds. So I think this is going to be something that we can only engage with in the best way possible. And I think not just with India, but in many parts of the globe. But this is a lived reality, and I think things will emerge as they emerge.
Thank you, Kanchi. Over to you, Dolly. 2 minutes.
Thanks so much. I think all I'm going to say is that, the question from Afghanistan made me think about cuisine and how what is Afghan cuisine in a way really is at the heart of how the idea of taste, food, migration really opens up regions. And what's happened perhaps in the 20th century with securitization is really the territorialization and the boundary making. And with that, a lot of things have been criminalized. People, movement, commodities. And maybe I can say with some hope, a sentence that what plants and animals show us is that no matter how much securitization stops human traffic and travel, plants, seeds, animals constantly cross. And perhaps they are the ones who will eventually give us more hope to think about an inclusive world, like the elephants who go between Manas and Bhutan, like the fish mint that grows in the northeast and across Burma and into Thailand and Laos, Cambodia. And I think that's where I see hope, that beyond securitization, we can continue conversations.
Thank you, Dolly. Let me try and put in a 2 minutes worth in answer to, again, a question by Rakesh Kalshan, which is on the political challenge of the Chinese juggernaut of infrastructure-based development to India, and how perhaps India can actually meet this challenge. And I think that's where the hopeful part of it is. I mean, yes, India replicates many of the processes or systems or approaches to development that the Chinese have, but I think that's partly to do with, and I teach a course in science tech and international relations here at the university, and it's partly to do with this common lexicon of development that we seem to have adopted across boundaries. The Chinese have done it following the West. Now the Indians have done it following the West. But now I think both the Chinese and the Indians are beginning to take on indigenous concepts a bit more seriously. So I think Rajni is right to be hopeful that we are beginning to re-examine some of these assumptions that we made about development, about politics as usual. And the really interesting part is what China is doing, since we are now beginning to watch so closely in India. I think we are also challenged to do things differently from the West and from China, and yet with reference to the best of what our independence movement gave us in terms of constitutional obligations or constitutional rights. So I think while there is competitive infrastructure development in the Northeast, keeping in Ladakh, keeping China in mind, local communities are beginning to react. Local communities are actually looking across the border and saying, look, if the Chinese can provide development, why isn't development being provided here? But it is also not any kind of development. It is a development that speaks to Indian realities and Indian constitutional values. So it's been a trend along the LAC, the line of actual control between India and China, that these regions have been depopulated. Border communities have been moved away. I mean, I could add another example to what Dolly has said about the ethnic communities that hunt across both sides of the line of actual control in the Dibang Valley, for example, right? The Mishing. So, either Mishmi, sorry. So the point is, this is happening. This sort of reaction, pushback is happening, and that space, at least I like to think, remains open because of a combination of the kind of work that academics do, people in this dossier have done, the legal system is trying to do, despite all that is holding it back, and political parties, political activists political actors are doing. I think we have a tendency to dismiss all politics as corrupt and beyond redemption. But I think if we lose hope that way, then we lose hope in being different from China as well. And also creating an Indian way. I'm not calling, this is not a call for parochialism, but I think there can be an Indian way of taking the best of both Western democracy as well as efficient and responsive economic development, infrastructure development that is possible in India. So for that, I think these are important steps. This conversation is an important step, and I'd like to thank all the panelists, Rajni Bakshi, Kanchi Kohli, and Dolly Kikon. And I'd invite the audience to please look very, very closely at their work, excellent work, and all public-facing, social media-friendly work. So nothing impossible to grasp or to follow and to understand or incorporate in your thinking and your own work. So thank you all for this excellent discussion, and thank you to the audience and to the Heinrich Stiftung for putting all of this together. And I wish you all a good evening and a good day wherever you are. Thank you, and bye-bye.